I froze on the roadside, gravel crunching under my boots as I stared at my only son, writhing beside the wreck. His voice, strained with fake agony, cut sharper than any wound. "Dad's truck did this to me," he told the police. The words sliced through the autumn air, turning father into culprit in an instant. My chest tightened, not from age or sickness, but from betrayal. After everything I'd given him, after years of sacrifice, Eric wasn't my son anymore. He was my accuser. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Rick Dalton sat alone in the dim light of his living room, a photo frame resting on his lap. The image inside was worn with age, a smiling woman with her arms wrapped around two small children. His wife had been gone for over 20 years, yet the memory of raising Eric and Lisa alone was still sharp, a scar he carried with quiet dignity. He had worked double shifts at the steel mill, his hands cracked and burned, just to put food on the table. For Lisa, it seemed worth it. She had grown into a woman of strength and compassion. But with Eric, something had gone wrong. Something Rick couldn't put into words, though it gnawed at him every night. That evening, the door creaked open and Eric entered, his face drawn, but eyes darting with restless energy. He sat down across from his father, tapping his knee impatiently. "Dad, I need a loan," he began without hesitation. "Just a small one. Some urgent debts I gotta clear. If I don't, things are gonna get ugly." His tone carried the same entitlement Rick had heard too many times before. Rick studied his son, noting the stubble on his chin, the twitch in his jaw. "Eric, I can't keep doing this," Rick said, his voice heavy, tired. "I've covered your rent, your car, even that mess with the credit cards. Every time it's urgent. Every time you promise it's the last, but it never is." Eric's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening. "So, that's it? You'd rather watch me drown? Some father you are. You've never really supported me. Not once." The words cut deeper than Eric realized. Rick flinched, gripping the photo frame tighter in his hands. He thought of the nights he'd skipped meals so Eric could have shoes for school, the nights he'd come home coated in soot, collapsing on the couch just to wake up 4 hours later and do it again. To hear his son accuse him of neglect felt like a knife twisting in his chest. Eric stood abruptly, chair legs scraping against the wooden floor. His voice rose with bitterness. "You've always favored Lisa. You look at me like I'm some disappointment. Well, you'll see. You'll all see." The door slammed behind him, leaving the house trembling with silence. Rick sat motionless for a moment, his breath shallow. Lisa appeared in the doorway, having overheard enough to know what happened. Her eyes softened as she moved closer, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Dad, he doesn't mean it," she whispered, though her tone carried no conviction. "Eric's angry, but he'll cool off. He's just lost." Rick tried to smile for her sake, but it faltered. He placed the photo back on the table, the glass catching the lamplight. "I keep hoping he'll find his way, but every time he asks for more, it feels like I'm just helping him sink deeper." Lisa sat beside him, her presence a balm, though her face betrayed her fear. She knew her brother's resentment wasn't just anger, it was festering into something darker, something that might tear them apart. She wanted to believe Eric would come back to reason, but deep down, she doubted it. Later that night, Martha Dalton, Rick's sister, stopped by. She was a woman of sharp eyes and steady words, and she didn't waste time with pleasantries. After hearing the story, she shook her head grimly. "Rick, he's spiraling. I've seen that look in men before, and it never ends well. You've given him enough rope. If you keep handing him more, he'll use it to hang the whole family." Rick leaned back weary. "He's still my son, Martha." Her gaze softened, but her words held firm. "And that's why it's going to hurt worse. He's not done. Not yet." When the house grew quiet again, Rick sat at the edge of his bed, staring into the dark. His hands clasped, lips moving in a silent prayer. "Lord," he whispered, voice breaking, "please don't let it get worse." But somewhere inside, he already feared the storm had only just begun. Rick was dozing in his armchair when the phone shrilled through the quiet of the house. He jolted awake, heart racing as if yanked from a bad dream. The voice on the other end was frantic, clipped, someone from the sheriff's office. "Mr. Dalton, your son's been in a serious accident. You better get down here right away." The words barely landed before Rick was on his feet, fumbling for his keys. His chest tightened with fear as he hurried to his truck. He drove through the night air with his knuckles white on the wheel, every terrible image flashing through his mind. Eric bleeding, Eric broken, Eric gone. For all the hurtful words his son had spat, Rick's love hadn't wavered. He prayed aloud, desperate, his voice trembling in the cab. "Lord, don't take my boy, please don't take him." Red and blue lights lit up the dark stretch of country road when Rick arrived. The sight slammed into him like a punch. Eric's car sat twisted against a ditch, its front end crumpled, steam hissing from under the hood. Shards of glass glittered in the beams of headlights, and the acrid smell of burnt rubber filled the air. Police officers directed traffic around the scene, while paramedics crouched near the wreckage. Rick stumbled forward, chest heaving, until his eyes locked on Eric. His son was sprawled on the ground, groaning, clutching his side, as two paramedics worked around him. His face was smeared with dirt and streaks of blood, but his eyes, sharp and darting, caught sight of his father immediately. "Dad!" Eric rasped, his voice strained, almost rehearsed. "It was you, your truck. You ran me off the road." Rick froze, as though the ground had given way beneath him. "What?" he whispered, barely able to form the word. Eric grimaced, writhing as if in agony. "You pulled out of the lot. You weren't watching. I swerved. And this." He gestured weakly toward the wreck, his voice breaking. "Your old truck caused this." The accusation burrowed into Rick's chest like a nail. He staggered back, his throat closing. Just hours ago, his son had stormed out in anger, and now here he was, bleeding, blaming him for a near-death crash. The weight of guilt pressed down hard, suffocating. What if it was true? What if his carelessness had destroyed his own son? One of the officers glanced sharply at Rick, his pen already scratching notes into a pad. Another exchanged a quiet look with the paramedics, as if the claim needed to be taken seriously. Rick's mind swirled with panic. He wanted to defend himself, to shout that he hadn't even left his house that night. But the sight of Eric lying there, his only son, broken and bruised, sapped the words from his throat. His lips trembled. He couldn't bring himself to argue, not here, not now. "Sir, we'll need your statement," an officer murmured, his tone careful, unreadable. Rick nodded numbly, unable to process the cold detachment in the man's eyes. The paramedics lifted Eric onto a stretcher. He groaned loudly, clutching his leg, his face twisted in pain. But every so often, his eyes flicked toward Rick, sharp and calculating, as if measuring his father's reaction. Rick pressed his hands together, muttering under his breath. The guilt, the shame, the fear. It all tangled inside him like barbed wire. He had raised Eric to be his pride, his legacy. And now, under the glare of police lights, that legacy was pointing a finger straight back at him. As the ambulance doors slammed shut and the siren wailed into the night, Rick stood rooted by the roadside, staring at the wreckage. Officers continued their quiet notes, the whisper of suspicion hanging in the air like smoke. He clutched his chest, fighting for breath, his thoughts spinning in a storm of disbelief. Had his own son really just blamed him for this? And worse still, would the world believe him? The fluorescent lights of the emergency scene flickered against the wet pavement as paramedics worked swiftly. Rick stood a few feet away, arms crossed tight against his chest, watching helplessly as his son moaned on the stretcher. Eric's voice rose and fell in pained theatrics, drawing the attention of every uniform on the scene. But one man wasn't convinced. Scott Miller, a veteran paramedic with 20 years in the field, had seen real spinal injuries before. He'd seen men paralyzed, their faces pale with shock, their movements non-existent. What he saw here didn't fit. Eric clutched at his lower back, groaning for the officers to hear, yet moments earlier, Scott had watched him shift on the ground, lifting himself too easily. His legs had bent naturally when he thought no one was looking. The inconsistency nagged at Scott's trained eye like a splinter. He bent over Eric, adjusting the neck brace. "Try not to move," Scott instructed, calm but firm. Eric let out another dramatic moan, gritting his teeth. His eyes flicked to the small crowd that had gathered, ensuring they saw his struggle. Scott narrowed his gaze but said nothing, at least not yet. He finished strapping Eric to the stretcher, but his suspicion lingered. As the police stepped aside, Scott took the opportunity to walk over to Rick, who was pale and trembling near the patrol car. "Mr. Dalton?" Scott's voice was low, steady. He glanced over his shoulder to make sure Eric was out of earshot. Then, in a tone that carried weight, he said, "Something's off here." Rick blinked, stunned. "Off? What do you mean?" His voice cracked, torn between hope and fear. Scott leaned closer, keeping his words measured. "I've been doing this a long time. Your son's injuries, they don't line up with what he's showing. He's moving too freely for a spinal injury. The pain, it looks exaggerated." Rick's breath hitched. He stared at the ground, shaking his head slowly. No, he wouldn't fake something like this. He couldn't. Scott studied him, recognizing the torment etched in the older man's face. He softened his tone. "I understand he's your son, but I'm telling you, it doesn't add up. You should be prepared for that possibility." Rick swallowed hard, his mind fighting the thought. To accuse his boy of lying about this, of pretending injury in front of half the town, that was unthinkable. And yet, the paramedic's words wormed their way into his chest, stirring doubt he didn't want to feel. Across the way, Eric caught sight of them talking. His eyes narrowed, suspicion flashing across his face. When Scott glanced back toward him, Eric immediately arched his back, crying out louder, writhing in pain, as though a lightning bolt had struck him. His groans echoed through the night, louder now, convincing in their desperation. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They scribbled notes, but kept their expressions guarded. One muttered something about filing a full report before tucking his pad away. Nothing definitive, just words on paper that could later be twisted either way. Rick rubbed at his temples, the night's chaos pressing in on him. He wanted to believe his son, to protect him, but Scott's steady voice lingered in his ears, clashing with Eric's dramatic wails. Guilt gnawed at him, and so did suspicion. The two warred inside his chest until he thought it might split open. The ambulance doors closed with a metallic thud. Eric's cries grew muffled as the vehicle prepared to pull away. Officers wrapped up their notes, none committing to any conclusion, just procedure, just the system grinding forward. Rick stood frozen as red lights washed over his weathered face. The last image he saw before the ambulance drove off was Eric staring through the small rear window, his eyes cold, sharp, and unflinching, even as his body trembled with supposed agony. Scott gave Rick one last look, as though silently reminding him of what he'd said, before turning back to his work. Rick climbed into his own truck, the steering wheel trembling under his hands. His heart pounded with conflict. Could Scott be right? Could Eric truly sink that low? The thought made him sick, but it refused to leave. He drove away slowly, taillights fading into the dark, carrying with him a single, gnawing question. Was his son a victim or a liar? The morning was quiet, almost deceptively peaceful. Rick sat at the kitchen table, his coffee cooling untouched, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. The knock on the door startled him. When he opened it, a man in a crisp suit handed him a thick envelope, his expression practiced and professional. "Mr. Dalton, you've been served." Rick stood frozen in the doorway as the man walked back to his car without another word. His hands trembled as he tore the envelope open. Legal jargon filled the pages, but the bold words leapt out at him like fire. Eric Dalton versus Richard Dalton. Claim of negligence. Damages sought. $500,000. The world tilted. Rick staggered backward, dropping into the nearest chair. His heart thundered in his chest, his breath ragged. His own son had filed a lawsuit against him. The papers blurred as tears welled in his eyes. By the time Lisa arrived later that day, she found her father still sitting at the table, the envelope spread open like evidence of a crime. She scanned the pages, her face reddening with fury. "This is disgusting," she snapped, her voice trembling with rage. "He's suing you. $500,000. He's not even pretending this is about justice. This is greed, pure and simple. He's a vulture, Dad, feeding off you, bleeding you dry." Rick rubbed his forehead, unable to meet her eyes. "He's my son," he whispered. The words sounded weaker each time he spoke them, like they were losing their meaning. "My only boy." Lisa slammed the papers onto the table. "No, Dad. A son protects his father, not destroys him. What kind of man does this?" Her voice cracked, but her anger held strong. That evening, Martha came by, her jaw tight, eyes sharp with conviction. She read the papers in silence, then set them down with deliberate care. "Rick, you can't let this stand. You've spent your life breaking your back for him, and this is how he repays you. He's dragging your name through the mud and trying to take everything you've worked for. You have to fight." Rick looked at his sister, torn between her certainty and the ache in his chest. "But he's still my son, Martha, my blood. Fighting him in court. It feels like cutting my own heart out." Martha leaned forward, her voice low but unyielding. "That boy made his choice when he filed these papers. This isn't about family anymore. It's about survival. If you don't defend yourself, he'll ruin you." Rick sat in silence, the weight of betrayal pressing down harder than he had ever felt. He thought of the nights he had carried Eric on his shoulders, the scraped knees he had bandaged, the Christmas mornings where Eric's laughter had filled the house. All of it felt poisoned now, twisted into a weapon pointed back at him. He picked up the papers again, his hands shaking as he flipped through the legal threats that wore his son's name at the top. His chest ached as though a knife had been buried deep and left to twist. The house was silent long after Martha left. Lisa lingered at the doorway, watching her father stare into the pages as if searching for some sign that it wasn't real. Rick finally set them down, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fight him," he said, "but I don't know how to lose him either." The words hung in the air, heavy, unresolved. Outside, the night crept in through the windows, and Rick felt the walls of his world closing in. For the first time in his life, he wondered if his own son had truly become his enemy. Word traveled quickly in a small town, faster than truth ever could. Within days of the lawsuit, whispers began to trail Rick Dalton wherever he went. He could feel them like pricks on the back of his neck, the sideways glances, the lowered voices. That's the man who hurt his own son. The words stung worse than any wound, because they were spoken by neighbors he had known his whole life, people who had once trusted him, eaten at his table, borrowed his tools. Eric made sure the whispers didn't die. He strutted around town with a neck brace strapped tightly and a limp exaggerated with every step. At the diner, he'd ease himself carefully into a chair, wincing loud enough for half the room to notice. At the hardware store, he'd ask for help lifting the lightest box, drawing sympathy from strangers. And each time, his eyes would flicker with quiet triumph when he caught word of his father's disgrace spreading further. Sunday at church was worst of all. Rick walked into the familiar pew, his Bible clutched against his chest. He had expected sanctuary, but instead, he was met with silence. Conversations faltered as he passed. Families shifted away, avoiding his gaze. Some nodded stiffly, others looked down, as though proximity to him was shame enough. the sermon's words blurred in his ears, drowned out by the judgment pressing in from all sides. Beside him, Lisa's hands trembled in her lap. She leaned close, whispering through clenched teeth, "This is all Eric's doing. Look at him, playing the saint." Across the aisle, Eric sat upright, the brace high on his neck, his face a mask of suffering. He bowed his head piously during prayer, soaking up the sympathy of every parishioner who stole a glance. Rick closed his eyes, fighting back tears. He wanted to shout the truth, to rip the brace off his son's neck and expose the lie for what it was. But instead, he sat in silence, the weight of humiliation bending him lower than any sermon ever had. The lies deepened when Eric began telling anyone who would listen that his father was reckless behind the wheel. "Drinks more than he should," Eric confided loudly at the bar. "Drives that old truck like a man who's lost control." Soon enough, the rumors solidified into fact in the minds of townsfolk who had never once seen Rick take a drink. The breaking point came one afternoon at the grocery store. Rick reached for a carton of milk when a man he'd known since childhood, a neighbor from 2 streets over, stepped into his path. "Shame on you, Rick," the man muttered, his voice cold. "Hurting your boy and then lying about it. You've changed." Rick froze, the carton slipping from his grasp, splattering across the floor. The humiliation burned hotter than fire in his veins. He wanted to protest, to defend himself, but the man had already turned away, leaving Rick standing in the spill with the eyes of strangers fixed on him. By the time he got home, his shoulders sagged as though he carried the weight of the whole town. Lisa was livid when she heard. She paced the living room, her voice sharp, furious. "He's parading around like he's the victim, and people believe him. He's ruining your name, Dad. This isn't just about money anymore. It's about destroying you." Rick said nothing. He sat in his chair, staring at the floor, his silence heavier than words. Later that evening, Martha came by, her voice steady, her expression grim. She leaned close to her brother, lowering her tone to a whisper. "Rick, you can't stay quiet anymore. If you let him write the story, you'll be the villain in it forever." Rick lifted his head slowly, meeting her gaze. His eyes were tired, wounded, but something colder stirred behind them, a question of how long he could endure before breaking his silence. The sterile smell of disinfectant clung to the air as Rick sat on the crinkled paper sheet in Dr. Green's office. The old man's posture was slumped, his breathing heavy. He hated doctor visits, always had, but lately his chest had been tight, his nights restless. He looked at the floor as Dr. Green flipped through the chart, the sound of papers louder than words. Finally, the doctor set the file down and folded his hands. His expression was grave, not the professional mask Rick was used to seeing, but genuine concern. "Rick, we need to talk seriously. Your blood pressure is through the roof. Your heart's under strain. And if you keep living like this, you're staring down the barrel of a heart attack." Rick blinked, forcing a bitter laugh. "A heart attack? Doc, I've worked the steel mill 30 years. I've carried weight that'd break a younger man. My heart's tougher than most." Dr. Green shook his head. "It's not the mill that's killing you. It's the stress. This lawsuit, the tension with Eric. It's eating you alive. And if it doesn't stop, your body will do what your pride won't. It'll put you down." The words sank in, heavy, but Rick straightened, a stubborn fire burning in his eyes. "I can't let him destroy me, Doc. I can't just roll over and let him take everything. He's my son, but he's also trying to ruin me. If I back down now, I'll die anyway, just slower." Later that evening, Lisa found him in his chair, the doctor's warning still echoing in his ears. She sat on the armrest, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Her voice trembled as she pleaded, "Dad, maybe we should think about settling. Just give him something. It's not worth your health, not worth your life." Rick turned his head, meeting her desperate gaze. His jaw clenched, his voice low but firm. "Lisa, if I give in, then he wins. He learns that betrayal pays, and the man I've tried to be, honest, hardworking, fair, that man dies inside me. I can't settle, not with him, not with this. Tears welled in Lisa's eyes. She wanted to argue, to break through the stubborn wall of pride and pain, but she saw the steel in her father's expression. She nodded, though her heart ached with fear. A few nights later, Rick drove through town, the neon lights of the local bar spilling onto the sidewalk. He had no intention of stopping, but something caught his eye through the window. There was Eric, the brace hanging loosely around his neck, laughing with a group of friends. A beer bottle clinked against the table as he leaned back in his chair, his body moving with ease, no trace of the agony he performed for the court and community. Rick's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He watched as Eric mimicked a limp for his buddies, then burst into laughter when they cheered his act. The sound, muffled through the glass, cut Rick deeper than any blade. His son wasn't just lying, he was flaunting the lie, parading it like a crown. Rick's chest heaved with restrained fury. He could feel the doctor's warning in every pounding heartbeat, but the anger coursed stronger than fear. For weeks, guilt and shame had weighed him down, convincing him maybe he was at fault. But now, watching Eric's mockery, the truth burned bright and undeniable. His son was playing him, and playing the town, for a fool. As he drove away, his face was set hard, the sorrow giving way to something darker. The seed of revenge, planted in the soil of betrayal, began to take root in his chest. It grew quietly, steadily, nourished by every lie Eric told, every humiliation Rick endured. He didn't yet know what shape it would take, but one truth settled heavy in his bones. This wasn't just about surviving the lawsuit anymore. This was about exposing the son who had turned against him, no matter the cost. And as Rick lay awake that night, staring into the darkness, his heartbeat loud in his ears, he whispered to himself the words that had begun to define him. He won't destroy me. Not now. Not ever. The late afternoon sun was sinking, casting long shadows across the quiet streets when Rick Dalton eased his old truck to a stop a few yards from the corner market. He sat low in the seat, hands tight on the steering wheel. For the first time in his life, he felt like a spy in his own town, tailing his own flesh and blood. It made him sick, but it also felt necessary. He had heard from a neighbor that Eric was spending more time out and about than his injuries should have allowed. The thought gnawed at Rick, so here he was, parked in silence, watching, waiting. Then Eric appeared. The brace was gone. His steps were quick, easy, and smooth as he walked into the store. Rick's pulse quickened. A half hour later, Eric emerged carrying 2 overstuffed grocery bags. Rick watched in disbelief as his son swung the bags into the trunk with no hesitation, no grimace of pain. The boy who claimed he could barely walk was lifting 20 pounds of food without breaking a sweat. Rick fumbled for the old phone in his jacket pocket, his hands trembling but steadying as he raised it. He zoomed in, snapping picture after picture, each one freezing Eric's betrayal in cold, undeniable detail. Eric shifted a case of bottled water from one arm to the other, laughing as he waved to a group of friends loitering by the entrance. Rick's breath hitched when he saw his son joking animatedly, twisting his body with ease, slapping one friend on the back. The limp, the grimaces, the pained sighs, gone, like they had never existed. Here was the truth, unfiltered, unperformed. For a moment, Rick just sat there, stunned. The sound of the camera shutter still echoed in his ears. His son, his blood, had not only lied to him, but had lied to an entire town, a court, and God himself on Sunday mornings. He drove straight home, every mile heavy with a mix of fury and vindication. Lisa was waiting in the living room, her face tense with worry. Without a word, Rick handed her the phone and gestured for her to look. She scrolled through the photos, her breath catching sharply. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling between relief and outrage. He's carrying groceries, lifting water like it's nothing. Rick nodded grimly. The injuries are a performance, Lisa. He's been playing us all. Lisa pressed the phone to her chest, her eyes wide with disbelief. People need to see this. They need to know he's lying. Later that evening, Martha came over. She sat down heavily at the table as Rick slid the phone across to her. She put on her reading glasses, scrolling carefully through each photo. When she finally looked up, her expression was hard, her eyes sharp as steel. "Now you have proof," she said, her voice steady. "Not suspicion, not whispers, proof. He can't wiggle out of this, Rick. He wanted to shame you in front of this town. You've got the truth that'll shame him back." Rick leaned back in his chair, for the first time in weeks, feeling something other than guilt and humiliation. Power coursed through him, not the kind he had ever sought in life, but the kind born from holding evidence, from knowing the lie was no longer invincible. He stared at the phone, the photos glowing back at him like ammunition. For the first time since this nightmare began, the weight shifted off his chest. He was no longer defenseless. He had something Eric could not explain away. And as night fell over the Dalton house, Rick sat quietly at the table, his fingers drumming against the wood, the corners of his mouth tightening into the faintest hint of a grim smile. Because now the game had changed. It was a gray afternoon when a knock came at Rick Dalton's door. He rose slowly from his chair, weary from days of restless nights, and opened it to find Scott Miller standing on the porch. The paramedic looked different out of uniform, plain clothes, a baseball cap in hand, but the steadiness in his eyes was the same. "Mr. Dalton," Scott said quietly, "I hope I'm not intruding." Rick's heart lifted and sank all at once. He stepped aside, gesturing him in. "Come in, son. I didn't expect to see you here." Inside, the house carried the heavy silence of a man under siege. Scott looked around, then settled into the chair across from Rick. For a long moment, he said nothing, as if choosing his words with care. Then he leaned forward. "I wanted to talk to you about that night," he began. "At the crash. What I saw, it wasn't right. I've been turning it over in my head ever since." Rick's breath caught. He gripped the armrest, his eyes locked on the younger man. "Go on," he urged. Scott nodded slowly. "Your son, he was faking it. At least, faking the severity. The way he moved when he thought nobody was looking. The way his injuries didn't line up. It wasn't consistent with what he was claiming. I didn't want to say it in front of everyone, not then. But I can say it now. I know what I saw, and I'd stand by it under oath if I had to." For a moment, Rick couldn't speak. His throat tightened, his vision blurred. All the shame, all the whispers, all the moments of self-doubt he had carried. It felt like a dam breaking inside him. He covered his face with one hand, his chest shuddering with a mixture of relief and grief. "You don't know what this means to me," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "I thought I was losing my mind, thought maybe I was the one in the wrong. Hearing you say this, it's like someone finally turned on the lights." Scott's expression softened. "You're not crazy, Mr. Dalton. You've been set up. And I won't let the truth stay buried if it comes to that." Just then, Lisa stepped in from the kitchen, having overheard enough to understand. Her face was pale, her eyes wet with both gratitude and dread. She sat beside her father, holding his hand. "Mr. Miller, I appreciate what you're offering," she said carefully, "but you don't know my brother. If you go up against him, he'll make you regret it. He'll spin this every which way. He'll try to ruin you too." Scott shook his head firmly. "I've faced worse than lies. I became a paramedic to save lives, not to watch someone weaponize a fake injury. If he tries to ruin me, so be it." Lisa turned to her father, her voice breaking. "Dad, please, be careful. You're already under enough strain. I don't want to lose you to this fight." Rick squeezed her hand, steadying her. Then Martha's voice broke the heavy silence as she stepped into the room, having arrived quietly through the side door. She had listened long enough to know what was said. Her eyes shone with resolve as she looked between Rick and Scott. "Lisa's right to worry," she said softly, "but fear won't change the truth. And the truth, that's the only weapon you have. If this young man is willing to stand by what he saw, then that weapon is sharper than anything Eric can throw at you." Rick looked from his sister to his daughter, then back at Scott. His hands trembled, but not from weakness. This time, it was from the surge of something he hadn't felt in months: strength. He straightened in his chair, his jaw firming, his eyes narrowing with resolve. "Then it's decided. If Eric wants a fight in court, he'll have one. I won't cower anymore. I'll face him, with truth on my side." The room fell silent, the air charged. Lisa held her father's hand tighter, fear etched in her face. Martha's gaze was steady, proud, and Scott nodded once, a soldier ready to stand beside a man who refused to be broken. Rick leaned back, his chest rising with a steady breath. For the first time since the nightmare began, he no longer felt cornered. He felt armed. And somewhere deep inside, a fire had been lit. The conference room was cold, sterile, and buzzing with the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Rick sat at one end of the long oak table, his lawyer beside him, papers neatly stacked like weapons waiting to be drawn. Across the table, Eric slouched into his chair, a brace around his neck, and a cane leaning dramatically against his leg. His lawyer whispered in his ear. But Eric's eyes were fixed on his father, sharp, venomous, burning with a hatred that had only grown since the lawsuit began. The court reporter adjusted her machine, clearing her throat. "We're on record," she said, her voice flat. "Deposition of Eric Dalton, plaintiff." Eric shifted in his chair, wincing theatrically, as though the very act of sitting upright was unbearable. He placed a hand on his back, let out a loud groan, and shot a quick glance toward Rick to make sure the performance was noticed. Rick didn't flinch. He sat still, his hands folded, watching quietly as if observing a stranger. The opposing lawyer, a seasoned man with sharp features and a sharper tongue, leaned forward. "Mr. Dalton, let's go back to the night of the accident. You claim you were struck by your father's truck at approximately 9:15 p.m. on Route 6. Is that correct?" "Yes," Eric said quickly, his voice strained. "I saw his truck pull out, and I swerved. Next thing I knew, I was in the ditch. My back's been killing me ever since." The lawyer nodded, flipping through his notes. "Interesting, because the police log indicates the call for assistance came in at 8:42 p.m. That's nearly half an hour earlier than your claim. Can you explain the discrepancy?" Eric's jaw tightened. "That must be a mistake. The cops must have logged it wrong. I know what time it was. I looked at the clock on my dash." The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "So the police report, the 911 timestamp, and the dispatch record are all wrong. But you, in the middle of a traumatic crash, noted the exact time?" Eric's face flushed red. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his limp suddenly exaggerated as he rubbed at his leg. "You think I'm lying? I was in pain. He broke off, snarling at Rick. "He knows what he did. Don't let him sit there acting innocent." Rick's lawyer calmly interjected. "Mr. Dalton, please answer the question directly. This isn't about your father's demeanor. It's about your testimony." Eric's voice rose, frustration seeping through the cracks. "I told you what happened. He ran me off the road. You want me to explain how cops mess up their paperwork? Ask them, not me." Across the table, Rick remained silent, but a flicker of satisfaction warmed him. He could see it, the first signs of strain in Eric's carefully constructed mask. For weeks, his son had played the victim with flawless precision, but now, under pressure, the cracks were starting to show. Lisa, sitting just behind her father, caught it too. Her eyes widened slightly as she leaned forward, watching her brother unravel. She had feared Eric's performance would sway everyone, but here, for the first time, he wasn't in control. The lawyer pressed further, his voice calm but relentless. We'll come back to the timeline inconsistencies. For now, please describe your injuries again, in detail. Eric groaned louder, clutching his side. I can barely stand some days. I can't work, can't sleep. Every step is agony. He glared at Rick, venom dripping from every syllable. And it's his fault. But the lawyer's pen scratched across the page, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he too had seen through the act. When the deposition ended, Eric limped from the room, his performance intact but fraying. Rick remained seated, calm, his silence speaking volumes. Lisa leaned toward him, her whisper barely audible. He's slipping, Dad. People are going to see it. Rick exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the door Eric had stormed through. For the first time, he felt the tide shifting ever so slightly in his favor. The poison spread quietly at first, a murmur here, a sideways glance there. But soon, the whispers grew louder, sharper, and Rick Dalton could feel them in every corner of town. He had survived steel and fire in the mill, but nothing prepared him for the sting of lies spoken in hushed tones. Eric had crossed a new line. At the bar, in the diner, even at church, he claimed his father had been abusive when he was a boy. He was cruel behind closed doors, Eric whispered to anyone who would listen. Hit me, neglected me, made me feel worthless. The words traveled like wildfire, searing through the community that had once admired Rick as a man of quiet dignity. Neighbors who used to wave from their porches now kept their distance. Old friends avoided eye contact in the grocery aisle. Rick could see the doubt in their eyes. Could it be true? Lisa was livid when the rumors reached her ears. She stormed into the bar where Eric was holding court, his brace hanging loosely around his neck like a cheap stage prop. How dare you? She spat, her voice trembling with fury. You're telling people Dad abused you? You know that's a lie. Eric leaned back in his chair, smirking, a beer in his hand. His friends chuckled as he looked her up and down with mock pity. Oh, Lisa. Always Daddy's little angel, huh? Of course you'd defend him. You never saw what he did to me because you were too busy being the favorite. Her cheeks burned with rage, but her voice didn't waver. You're sick, Eric. Twisting things, making up stories just to destroy him. You're not just a liar. You're cruel. Eric chuckled darkly, leaning in close so only she could hear. Cruel? No, sis. I'm just playing the game, and the town's already choosing sides. He raised his beer in a mocking toast. Guess who's winning? Lisa turned on her heel, her eyes wet with frustrated tears. Outside, she pressed her back against the wall, her breath ragged. She wanted to scream, but all she could do was think of her father, sitting at home, unaware of how deep Eric's venom had sunk. When she told Rick what Eric had said, he sat at the kitchen table staring at his hands. His shoulders sagged, and his eyes were dull with hurt. He's not just suing me anymore, Rick whispered. He's trying to erase me, everything I ever did for him, all the nights I worked till my hands bled, and now he wants the world to believe I was a monster. Martha came by that evening, settling beside her brother. She laid a hand gently on his back, her voice low and steady. Rick, you know who you are. You know what you did and didn't do. Lies can't change the truth, and anyone who really knows you will see through this in time. But Rick's pain was written all over his face. The betrayal wasn't just public now. It was personal, cutting into his very identity as a father. The next day, Dr. Green reviewed his latest tests and shook his head gravely. Rick, this stress is killing you. Literally. Your heart can't handle much more. If you don't find a way to ease this burden, the lawsuit won't matter. You won't live long enough to see it end. Rick stared at the doctor, the words pressing down like iron. But instead of breaking him, they sparked something harder inside. He straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing. If it kills me, so be it, he said, his voice low and steady. But I won't let him win. Not like this. The doctor sighed, knowing there was no convincing him otherwise. Rick left the office with his head high, though every step felt heavier than the last. The storm wasn't just closing in, it was inside him now. And yet, his resolve had never been sharper. The knock on the door came early, just as the sun was breaking over the horizon. Rick opened it to find a man in a plain suit, tall, sharp-featured, with a badge clipped discreetly to his belt. He introduced himself with a firm handshake. "Detective Harris, mind if I come in?" Rick hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside. The detective's presence carried a quiet authority, and something in his eyes told Rick he wasn't here for small talk. Harris settled at the kitchen table, spreading out a slim folder with careful precision. "I've been looking into your son's finances," Harris began, his voice calm but deliberate. "Eric's lawsuit caught my attention, and when I dug deeper, things didn't add up. I think you need to see this." Rick's chest tightened. He leaned forward as Harris opened the folder. Inside were documents, bank statements, insurance claims, accident reports. Harris slid the top page across the table. "Here," he said, tapping the paper. "Your son's car accident isn't his first. Over the last 5 years, Eric's filed 3 separate insurance claims. Each one involves suspicious circumstances: rear-end collisions, property damage, even a slip and fall at a friend's shop. Every time the payout kept him afloat a little longer." Rick's hands trembled as he picked up the papers. He scanned them slowly, his eyes narrowing with each line. "You're saying he's been running scams?" Harris nodded. "Patterns don't lie. The claims are consistent, always inflated, always designed to cash out fast. And now? Suing his own father is just an escalation. He's desperate. The walls are closing in on him financially, and he saw you as the biggest target." Rick sank back in his chair, the weight of the revelation hitting him like a steel beam. Relief washed through him for a moment, confirmation that Eric's betrayal wasn't just imagined, that the lies had a pattern, a trail. But alongside the relief came fury, hot and consuming. His son hadn't stumbled into one mistake. He had built a life out of deception, and now he was dragging the family name through the dirt to save himself. Lisa entered the kitchen just as Harris continued laying out the evidence. She caught sight of the papers and froze, her face pale. What is this?" Rick handed her the documents wordlessly. As she read, her lips parted in disbelief. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling before she could stop them. "He's been lying for years. All those times he came begging for help, all those stories he spun." She pressed the papers to her chest, her voice breaking. "He's my brother, and he's a fraud." Rick reached for her hand, but his own shook too much to steady her. The ache in her voice tore at him, because it mirrored his own. They weren't just losing Eric. They were watching him burn every bridge and salt the ground behind him. Martha arrived later that morning. Harris repeated his findings, showing her the stack of evidence. Martha's expression remained steady, though her lips pressed into a tight line. When Rick finally broke the silence, his voice was low, strained with the effort of holding back anger. "He didn't just betray me. He betrayed this family. He betrayed Lisa. He betrayed his mother's memory. And for what? A few payouts? A lawsuit against the father who raised him?" Martha put a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "Rick, listen to me. You can't drown in the hurt. You have the truth now, and the truth is your shield. Use it. Harris wouldn't be here if this wasn't real. This isn't about hating your son. It's about surviving what he's become." Detective Harris closed the folder, his tone firm. "I'll testify if it comes to that. The court deserves to know who Eric really is. But this will get messy, Mr. Dalton. He won't go down without a fight." Rick's gaze hardened, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "Then we fight. If Eric wants war, he'll get it. I've carried guilt long enough. Now I'll carry the truth." Lisa wiped her tears, nodding silently. Martha's hand remained steady on Rick's shoulder, anchoring him as the first shape of a plan began to form. The war wasn't just coming, it had already begun. And this time, Rick wouldn't face it empty-handed. The conference room smelled faintly of ink and old paper, its long table scattered with files, photographs, and notes. Rick sat at one end, his lawyer beside him, while across the table, Scott Miller, the paramedic, waited patiently. His hands were clasped in front of him, his expression calm, as though testifying to the truth was simply an extension of the job he had been doing all his life. Rick's lawyer slid a legal pad across the table. "Scott, I want you to be clear and specific. You'll be asked, 'What did you see?' and your answer must stay steady." Scott nodded. "I'll tell them exactly what I told Mr. Dalton. Eric's injuries didn't line up with what he claimed. His movement, his posture, it didn't match a man with a spinal injury. I've treated men paralyzed on the pavement. Eric wasn't one of them." Rick exhaled slowly, gratitude mingling with grief. He wished it hadn't come to this, that his son's lie could be undone without dragging strangers into it, but he knew the truth had to be laid bare. Next came neighbors, called in one by one. Mrs. Harper from across the street recalled seeing Eric carry firewood into his house late one evening, no limp, no brace. Another neighbor, Mr. O'Connor, described catching Eric unloading a heavy toolbox from his car, moving with ease until he noticed someone watching, at which point he clutched his back dramatically and staggered. The lawyer gathered each testimony carefully, stacking them into a wall of proof. Photographs were added, Rick's own snapshots of Eric carrying groceries, lifting a case of water bottles as though it weighed nothing. Piece by piece, the illusion Eric had constructed began to unravel. When the file was finally presented to the judge, the courtroom was still. Rick sat in the back, watching the judge's brow furrow as she flipped through page after page of statements and photographs. She didn't speak immediately, but her silence carried weight. Her expression shifted, not to disbelief, but to intrigue. For the first time, Rick sensed that the court saw cracks in Eric's mask. Word of the mounting evidence reached Eric quickly. Behind closed doors, his composure faltered. Alone in his apartment, he paced furiously, throwing the brace against the wall, his breath ragged. The mirror reflected a man unraveling, sweat beading on his forehead as he muttered to himself, "They don't get to win. He doesn't get to win." His fists clenched, knuckles white. But in public, Eric continued his charade. He hobbled into the bar with his cane, wincing for effect, smirking when townsfolk offered him pity. Yet beneath the performance, panic gnawed at him. The walls were closing in, and he could feel it. Lisa, unable to bear watching her brother spiral deeper, went to him one evening. She found him sitting in his living room, half-empty bottles scattered on the table, his brace discarded like an old costume. Her heart broke at the sight. "Eric," she said softly, stepping inside. "Please, stop this madness. It's gone too far. The evidence is piling up against you. Dad's health is failing under the stress. If you keep this up, you'll destroy him, and yourself." Eric looked up at her, his eyes cold, glassy. He let out a bitter laugh. "Destroy him? That's the point, Lisa. He deserves it. He's always looked at me like I was nothing. Now I'm going to make him feel it. I'll ruin him before I stop." Lisa's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes stinging with tears. She shook her head in disbelief, her voice breaking. "He loves you. He's loved you through everything, even when you didn't deserve it. And this is what you give back?" Eric leaned back in his chair, his smirk cruel. "Love doesn't pay debts. Love doesn't fix failure, but money does, and I'll bleed him for every cent until he has nothing left." Lisa turned away, her chest heavy, tears streaming freely as she left him there in the dim room, drowning in his bitterness. For the first time, she realized her brother was beyond reach. That night, back at her father's home, Lisa sat silently by Rick's side. She didn't tell him everything Eric had said. She couldn't bring herself to, but the pain in her eyes spoke enough. Rick looked at her, then at the pile of evidence on the table. His face was carved with grief, but beneath it, a quiet resolve hardened. The truth was gathering momentum, and soon it would collide head-on with Eric's lies. The war wasn't just on paper anymore. It was about to move into the courtroom, where masks would shatter and truth would either rise or be buried. The courthouse steps were crowded with attorneys, reporters, and locals who had come to witness the unfolding spectacle. The autumn air was sharp, carrying with it the murmur of voices, the clicking of cameras, the hushed anticipation of scandal. Rick Dalton moved slowly down the steps, his face pale but composed, his lawyer at his side. Every step felt heavier than the steel beams he had once carried in the mill. From the corner of his eye, he saw him, Eric. His son leaned casually against a pillar, the brace around his neck tilted just so, his cane tapping lightly against the concrete like a prop in a play. When their eyes met, Eric's mouth curled into a smirk. He pushed off the pillar and approached, each step deliberate, dripping with arrogance. "Dad," Eric said, his voice laced with mock sweetness, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Enjoying your day in court?" He leaned closer, his breath sour with liquor. "This is just the beginning. I'm going to bleed you dry." Rick stopped, his eyes narrowing. The weight of years of betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak pressed against his chest, but he held his ground. His voice was low, steady, carrying the quiet thunder of truth. "You already bled this family, Eric, long before you set foot in that courtroom." The smirk faltered for only a second before Eric laughed, sharp and cruel, the sound cutting through the air. He glanced at his father's trembling hands, the slight sway of his stance, the sweat beading on his forehead. "Look at you," Eric sneered. "You're falling apart. Everyone can see it. You won't last through this fight, old man. The stress will finish you before I do." Rick's chest tightened violently, a sudden pressure that stole his breath. He staggered, clutching the railing, his face blanching. For a terrifying moment, he thought his heart might give out right there on the courthouse steps. Gasps rippled through the small crowd, but Eric only stood back, arms folded, watching with a glint of satisfaction. Martha was the first to reach him, pushing past onlookers. She wrapped an arm firmly around her brother, her voice sharp with urgency. "Rick, breathe. Stay with me." She shot Eric a look of pure disgust, but he only raised his eyebrows as if amused by the scene. Rick leaned heavily on Martha, his body weak, his breaths shallow. Yet even as his strength faltered, his eyes never left Eric's. Rage and sorrow swirled inside him, but beneath them both lay something stronger, unyielding resolve. "You may break my body," Rick rasped, his voice thin but edged with steel, "but you will never break me." Eric chuckled, shaking his head. "We'll see about that." He turned and walked away, the cane tapping rhythmically against the concrete, his laugh echoing off the courthouse walls. Martha guided Rick toward the car, her grip steady, her eyes brimming with worry. "You can't let him push you this far," she whispered urgently. "Your health won't hold if you keep carrying this alone." Rick sank into the passenger seat, his chest still heaving. He rested his head back, closing his eyes for a moment, willing his body to steady itself. Then, with a whisper that carried more conviction than volume, he said, "I'll see this through, Martha. No matter what it costs me, I'll see it through." The car pulled away from the courthouse, leaving behind the buzz of voices, the flashing cameras, and Eric's mocking laughter. Inside the quiet cabin, Rick's words hung heavy, a vow carved into stone. The fight was no longer just about survival. It was about standing to the very end, even if it broke him. The courthouse loomed on the horizon like a fortress, its stone walls indifferent to the lives about to be torn apart inside. The trial was days away, and the entire town buzzed with anticipation. Everyone seemed to have an opinion, but few cared for the truth. Headlines had already chosen their narrative. son crushed by father's negligence, and a family torn apart by reckless driving. Each article painted Rick Dalton as careless, bitter, a man whose pride mattered more than his son's life. Meanwhile, Eric basked in the spotlight. He paraded through town in his brace, cane tapping against sidewalks, his limp exaggerated to the point of performance. Cameras followed him, microphones thrust forward as reporters asked how he felt about taking his own father to court. He would lower his head, voice trembling with practiced sorrow. "It breaks my heart," he said during one interview, pausing just long enough for effect. "But I have no choice. My father refuses to take responsibility. I loved him once, but now he's left me no option but to fight for justice." Clips of Eric's statements played on local news, followed by footage of him wincing as he climbed courthouse steps, aided by sympathetic strangers. He was the picture of the wounded son, wronged by his own blood, and the town bought it. Rick sat in his recliner one evening, the television flickering in front of him, Eric's voice spilling into his living room like poison. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. "Negligent father faces day in court." Rick gripped the armrest until his knuckles turned white. Each word cut deep, not because he cared what strangers thought, but because they were swallowing his son's lie whole. Lisa appeared in the doorway, a basket of laundry in her arms. She saw the look on her father's face, the television's cruel reminder, and she set the basket down with a sigh. Moving closer, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Dad," she said softly, "don't let this break you. The truth will outlive lies. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it will. Eric can only hide behind his mask for so long." Rick turned to her, his eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights. "It feels like the whole world's against me, Lisa. Like I'm the villain in his story." Lisa shook her head firmly. "No. You're the man who raised us, who carried us when Mom was gone. I know who you are, and soon they'll know too." Her words steadied him more than she realized. That night, Rick cleared the dining table and spread out the evidence file. Photographs of Eric carrying groceries, statements from neighbors, Scott Miller's testimony, Detective Harris's findings on past insurance scams. Each piece of paper was a lifeline, proof that the world wasn't entirely swallowed by lies. He read through every page slowly, carefully, highlighting, making notes. His lawyer had told him preparation was everything, but for Rick, it was more than that. It was survival. If he stumbled in that courtroom, Eric's story would swallow him whole. Martha arrived later with sandwiches and coffee. She didn't speak much, just sat with her brother as he pored over the papers, her presence grounding him. From time to time, she would place a steadying hand on his arm, reminding him he wasn't alone. The days slipped by too quickly, and before he knew it, the trial loomed on the calendar like an immovable shadow. Each night, Rick's sleep grew thinner, his dreams haunted by images of his son, standing triumphant in court while he was left humiliated, stripped of dignity. The night before the trial, the house was silent. Lisa had tucked her children into bed upstairs. Martha had gone home, and Rick sat alone at the table. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, each second louder than the last. His hands rested on the folder of evidence, the weight of it heavy, not just in paper but in meaning. He tried to sleep, but each time he closed his eyes, he saw Eric's sneer, heard his laugh, felt the sting of his words on the courthouse steps. "You won't last through this fight, old man." Rick rose from bed and returned to the dining table, staring at the file as though it could protect him in the morning. His chest ached, his breathing shallow, but his eyes burned with quiet determination. Tomorrow, the world would hear both sides. Tomorrow, the mask would either stay intact or shatter. As dawn crept closer, Rick sat in the dim light of his kitchen, his lips moving in a prayer not for victory, but for strength. And when he finally closed his eyes again, it was not peace that found him, but the weight of the storm about to break. The courthouse doors opened, and Eric Dalton made his entrance like an actor stepping onto a stage. He leaned heavily on his cane, his neck brace cinched so tight it seemed to swallow him. Each step was slow, deliberate, accompanied by exaggerated grimaces that echoed through the hushed courtroom. He paused dramatically before the jury box, letting them see every ounce of his supposed suffering. The jurors watched closely, their faces soft with sympathy. A few shifted uncomfortably, as if pitying the man forced to sue his own father. Rick, sitting quietly at the defense table, felt the sting of those looks. For weeks, he had carried the weight of their town's judgment. Now, 12 strangers carried it too. Eric's lawyer began with an opening statement filled with heavy words: negligence, irresponsibility, a son betrayed by his father's carelessness. Each sentence painted Rick as reckless, heartless, the architect of his own family's downfall. Rick kept his eyes lowered, his jaw tight, letting the words crash against him like waves. But then came the defense's turn. Rick's lawyer rose calmly, carrying a manila folder. He addressed the jury with measured confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just heard is a story. What you're about to see is the truth. From the folder, he pulled the first photograph. Eric, outside the grocery store, carrying heavy bags with ease. The image was passed down the line of jurors. Murmurs rippled through the box as eyes flicked from the photo to Eric, who sat stiffly, face tightening with unease. Another photo followed, Eric unloading a case of bottled water, bending and twisting freely. More murmurs rose, some jurors exchanging skeptical glances. For the first time, Eric's mask began to slip, not in front of the court, but behind his eyes where panic flickered. Rick lifted his gaze, meeting his son's eyes across the room. Eric's expression was no longer pained, it was venomous. He glared daggers at his father, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the cane. It was a look not of suffering, but of fury at being cornered. Lisa sat in the gallery, her hands clasped tight. She watched the jurors lean forward, intrigued, their pity for Eric mingling with doubt. Her heart pounded. She leaned closer to Martha and whispered, "They see it. They finally see it." Rick straightened in his chair. The shame that had weighed him down for months seemed to lift, if only slightly. His dignity, so battered and bruised, flickered back into life. For the first time in this ordeal, he felt the courtroom wasn't entirely his son's stage. Evidence had cut through the performance, and truth had found its first foothold. The judge called for a recess, gavel striking sharply. The jurors filed out, their faces unreadable but changed. The room buzzed with tension as lawyers shuffled papers, reporters scribbled notes, and Eric refused to meet anyone's eye but his father's. Rick inhaled slowly, steadying himself. The fight was far from over, but in this small victory, he felt strength return to his bones. For the first time, he believed his side of the story might actually be heard. Yet as he rose from his chair, Eric's stare burned into him, promising that the battle ahead would be merciless. The courtroom was packed, the kind of heavy silence that crackled with anticipation filling the air. Reporters leaned forward with pens poised, jurors sat stiff-backed, and Rick gripped the edge of the defense table so tightly his knuckles whitened. He knew what was coming. This was the moment where truth had to breathe louder than lies. The bailiff called the next witness, Scott Miller. Scott rose from the gallery, his frame steady, his expression calm. Dressed neatly in a dark jacket, he walked to the stand with the quiet authority of a man who had seen more chaos than most. After taking the oath, he settled into the witness chair, folding his hands in front of him. The defense attorney began gently. "Mr. Miller, could you please state your occupation for the court?" "I'm a paramedic," Scott replied, his voice clear, steady. "Been one for 22 years. And on the night of the accident involving Eric Dalton, were you on the scene?" "Yes, I was one of the responding paramedics," Scott confirmed. "Tell us, in your own words, what you observed." Scott's eyes flicked briefly to Rick, then to the jury. "When I arrived, Mr. Dalton, Eric, was lying near the vehicle, complaining of back pain, claiming he couldn't move well. But as I approached, I noticed inconsistencies. He adjusted his position on the ground multiple times without difficulty. He bent his knees, lifted his shoulders, movements you don't normally see in someone claiming a severe spinal injury. Murmurs rippled through the jury box. A few members leaned closer, taking in every word. The defense attorney nodded. So, in your professional experience, did his symptoms align with what he claimed? Scott's voice sharpened slightly. No, they did not. A hush fell across the room. Rick's heart pounded in his chest. His eyes locked on the man who had been the first to notice what Rick himself couldn't believe. Eric shifted violently in his chair, letting out a loud groan as if the testimony itself had triggered sudden pain. He arched his back, grabbing at his side, wincing theatrically. A few jurors glanced at him sympathetically, until Scott spoke again. You see that? Scott gestured calmly toward Eric, who was now twisting in mock agony. That's performance. If his injuries were as severe as he claims, he wouldn't be able to jerk around like that. Those movements are inconsistent with someone suffering long-term spinal trauma. The jury's sympathy visibly faltered, replaced by curiosity, even skepticism. Eric froze, caught mid-performance, his face tightening, as if he realized the act was unraveling before their eyes. Mr. Miller, the defense attorney continued, are you prepared to testify under oath that you believe Eric Dalton exaggerated his injuries? Scott didn't hesitate. Yes, I am prepared to testify that in my professional opinion, Mr. Dalton was faking the severity of his injuries that night. Eric slammed his hand against the table, his voice bursting out, raw with anger. That's a damn lie! Gasps rippled through the room. The judge's gavel cracked sharply. Mr. Dalton, you will remain silent, or I'll hold you in contempt of court. Eric's lawyer tugged at his sleeve, whispering harshly, but Eric's glare never left Scott, his jaw clenched with rage. Rick exhaled, his chest rising in the first deep breath he had managed in weeks. For the first time, someone else had spoken the truth aloud in front of everyone, stripping away the mask Eric had worn for so long. Lisa sat behind her father, her eyes shining with relief. She leaned forward, whispering, "It's working, Dad. They're seeing him for what he is." Rick nodded faintly, unable to speak, his throat tight with emotion. But his eyes, for the first time in months, carried not just pain, but hope. Scott remained composed, unshaken by Eric's outburst. He answered the final questions with steady conviction before stepping down from the stand. As he passed Rick, he gave the older man a subtle nod, a quiet reminder that truth was still standing beside him. The jurors whispered among themselves as they shuffled their notes. The balance in the room had shifted. Rick could feel it, subtle, fragile, but undeniable. And though Eric sat scowling, his body rigid, Rick knew the walls around his lies had begun to crack. The trial wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt winnable. The second day of trial carried a tension so heavy, it seemed to thrum through the air. The jury filed in, notebooks ready, their faces guarded yet curious. Reporters jostled in the back row, cameras flashing before the judge ordered them lowered. Rick sat at the defense table, his hands folded neatly, his heart steadying as he prepared for what he knew was coming. The bailiff called the next witness. Detective Michael Harris. A tall, composed man in a dark suit strode confidently to the stand. He swore the oath, then settled in the chair, his gaze unwavering. Where Scott had been calm and clinical, Harris radiated authority. His very presence demanded attention. The defense attorney approached the podium. Detective Harris, could you state your position and your involvement in this case? Harris leaned slightly forward. I'm a detective with the county's Financial Crimes Division. While reviewing Eric Dalton's claim against his father, I began looking into his financial history. What I found was a consistent pattern of fraudulent insurance claims spanning several years. The jury shifted in their seats. Interest peaked. The attorney nodded. And what specifically did you discover? Harris lifted a folder and began pulling out documents. Over the last 5 years, Eric Dalton has filed multiple insurance claims: auto accidents, workplace injuries, property damage. Each case followed a similar pattern: sudden accident, exaggerated injuries, swift payout. When compared side by side, the claims reveal striking similarities. He held up the first document. In 2019, Eric claimed he slipped and fell at a hardware store, injuring his back. Witnesses later reported seeing him lifting heavy equipment days after. Insurance paid out $12,000. Gasps rippled through the room. Harris continued, methodical, unflinching. In 2020, he reported a rear-end collision. His injuries again involved his back and neck. Within weeks, video evidence surfaced of him at a gym, lifting weights. Another payout, this time $18,000. Jurors leaned forward, eyes wide. Harris laid down the next file. In 2021, he claimed he was injured on a friend's property, again, back-related. Records show the friend received part of the payout. That's $9,000 more. Each revelation landed heavier than the last. By the time Harris pulled out the final file, Eric's current lawsuit against Rick, the jury sat stunned, mouths slightly open, pens scratching furiously across their notepads. The attorney's voice dropped, deliberate and sharp. Detective Harris, in your professional opinion, does Eric Dalton demonstrate a pattern of fraudulent behavior? Yes, Harris said firmly. The evidence shows a repeated pattern of staged or exaggerated accidents, all designed to extract money. His current claim against his father fits that same pattern. The silence shattered when Eric shot up from his chair, face crimson. Lies, he roared, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. All lies. He's making this up. He's twisting everything. The jury jolted at the outburst. Gasps filled the room. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. Mr. Dalton, sit down and remain silent, or I will hold you in contempt. Eric froze, chest heaving, his lawyer tugging at his sleeve in frantic whispers. With visible effort, he sank back into his chair, his hands gripping the cane so tightly it looked ready to snap. But the damage was done. The jury had seen not just the evidence, but his eruption, his mask crumbling under pressure. Rick, meanwhile, sat motionless, though the corners of his lips tugged into the faintest smile. He hadn't wanted to see his son humiliated, but the truth had been buried under lies for too long. At last, the world was seeing what he had always known. Lisa sat behind him, tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of release. For months, she had watched her brother torment their father, and now, with each document Harris laid out, justice edged closer. The defense attorney wrapped up. Detective Harris, would you be willing to testify further if needed? Absolutely, Harris replied without hesitation. As Harris stepped down, the jury's eyes followed him, their expressions no longer sympathetic to Eric. The weight of the evidence had shifted the room. Eric sat rigid, his face pale beneath the flush of rage. He stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched, his facade splintering with each breath. Rick leaned back in his chair, drawing in a slow, steady breath. For the first time in months, he felt lighter, as though truth itself had given him strength. But he didn't let the smile linger long. He knew the war wasn't over. The judge called for recess, her gavel striking sharply. The room erupted in whispers, reporters scribbling, jurors exchanging glances heavy with realization. And at the defense table, Rick's quiet satisfaction hardened into resolve. His son was unraveling before everyone's eyes, but the final battle was still to come. The air inside the courtroom was taut, stretched thin by days of testimony and mounting evidence. The jury sat stiffly, their faces weary yet attentive, while reporters hunched over their notepads, sensing the story had reached its boiling point. Rick sat quietly at the defense table, his hands folded, his eyes steady on the witness stand. He had learned to measure his breaths in here, to let calm be his only armor. The prosecution called another witness, a neighbor who had seen Eric walking without his cane late at night. The man's voice was simple, steady, his account clear. "I watched him unload tools from the back of his car," the neighbor said. "No limp, no brace, moved like nothing was wrong with him." The jury scribbled furiously, a few raising their brows. Eric's face flushed crimson. He gripped his cane so tightly his knuckles whitened, his leg bouncing with restrained fury. As the neighbor continued, Eric leaned forward, shaking his head violently. "Liar!" he spat before his lawyer could stop him. The courtroom froze. Gasps rose from the gallery. The judge fixed him with a cold, sharp glare. "Mr. Dalton, you will remain silent." But Eric couldn't stop. He shot to his feet, his chair clattering backward. His voice exploded, raw and venomous. "You people don't know anything. He's lying. They're all lying. This whole courtroom's against me." He pointed toward his father with a trembling hand. "And you—" His voice cracked into a scream. "You're the reason my life's a mess. You ruined me." The jury recoiled, some visibly horrified by the outburst. Their pens stopped moving. Every eye in the room was on Eric, and in that instant, his carefully constructed mask shattered. His lawyer tugged frantically at his sleeve. "Sit down, Eric. Sit down now." But Eric's rage only deepened. He turned back to the witness stand, his face twisted. "You think you can stand there and lie about me? I'll bury you for this." His voice cracked with fury, spittle flying as he shouted. The judge's gavel slammed down, the crack echoing like a gunshot. "Mr. Dalton, one more word, and I will hold you in contempt of court. Sit down immediately." For a moment, Eric stood frozen, his chest heaving, his face contorted with hate. Then, with a violent jerk, he snatched up his cane and collapsed into his chair, seething, eyes blazing at everyone around him. Lisa sat behind her father, her face pale, her hands trembling. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness, but of shame. She shook her head slowly, unable to look at her brother any longer. To see him unravel so completely, to watch him confirm every ugly truth, was more painful than she had imagined. Rick, however, remained calm. He didn't flinch, didn't move. He sat like stone, steady, watching his son's tantrum burn itself out. Inside, his heart ached, but outwardly, he allowed no crack in his composure. For the first time in months, it wasn't him the town judged. It was Eric. Martha leaned in close. Her voice a whisper meant only for her brother. "It's over, Rick. The jury saw it. They won't forget what he just did." Rick gave the smallest nod, his gaze fixed ahead. He knew Martha was right, but he also knew the fight wasn't truly finished until the gavel came down for the last time. Still, for the first time, he felt the weight of the trial begin to lift from his shoulders. Eric sat rigid, his face twisted with fury, his breath coming hard and fast. He looked less like a victim now, and more like a man cornered, stripped bare in front of everyone. His cane rattled against the floor as his hand trembled with barely contained rage. The courtroom settled into uneasy silence, but the damage was done. The jury had seen not just testimony, but truth unveiled in Eric's own voice, his own actions. Rick inhaled deeply, his chest rising steady. He didn't smile, but there was something in his eyes now, a flicker of victory, quiet, but undeniable. The trial was moving toward its end, and the mask Eric had worn for so long was in ruins. The courtroom was hushed, the kind of silence that carried weight. Everyone knew the end was near. After weeks of testimony, accusations, and revelations, the case had boiled down to this final moment. The judge gave a solemn nod, and Rick's attorney rose from the defense table. He didn't stride theatrically across the floor or raise his voice to the rafters. Instead, he walked with calm purpose to face the jury, a folder in hand, his tone steady and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you've heard many words in this courtroom. Stories, accusations, performances. But at its heart, this case isn't complicated. It comes down to two questions. Was Eric Dalton injured as he claims, and is his father responsible? He paused, letting the weight of the words settle before continuing. You saw the photographs. A man who claims to be crippled, lifting groceries, carrying water bottles, walking freely when he thought no one was watching. You heard from neighbors who saw the same. You heard from paramedic Scott Miller, who testified that Eric's symptoms didn't line up with any real spinal injury. And you heard from Detective Harris, who revealed years of insurance fraud, each claim following the same pattern of exaggeration and deceit. The jurors listened intently, their pens still, their faces fixed on him. The lawyer stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. This isn't about negligence. This isn't about a father who failed his son. This is about a son who betrayed his father, who weaponized lies to take what he did not earn. The evidence is clear. The truth is undeniable. He glanced briefly at Rick, then back at the jury. Do not reward fraud. Do not reward betrayal. Reward truth. With that, he returned to the defense table, his notes neatly stacked, his composure unshaken. Across the aisle, Eric's lawyer stood. His movements were hurried, his voice pitched higher, sharper. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, pacing too quickly. Don't let a few photographs cloud the real issue. Eric Dalton has suffered. He's endured pain, humiliation, and ridicule. He came to this courtroom seeking justice. But his words lacked the anchor of evidence. He stammered when referencing timelines, grew defensive when recalling details. The jury's eyes narrowed, their expressions skeptical. Some crossed their arms, others exchanged knowing looks. The contrast between the two attorneys couldn't have been sharper, one calm, precise, anchored in fact, the other scrambling, disorganized, a ship caught in a storm. Rick sat quietly, watching. For weeks, his heart had been weighed down with dread, but now, as he studied the jury's faces, something shifted inside him. Their expressions told a story all their own. Doubt about Eric had taken root, grown strong, and was no longer hidden. Lisa sat behind her father, her hands pressed together as if in prayer. She leaned closer to him, whispering, They know, Dad. They see it. This is almost over. Rick closed his eyes briefly, letting out a breath that felt like the first true release in months. It wasn't victory yet, but it was close enough to touch. Across the courtroom, Eric sat rigid, his face twisted with fury. He glared at his father, his eyes full of venom, as though willing him to collapse under the weight of his hatred. But Rick didn't flinch. For the first time, he met his son's stare head-on, calm and unyielding. The judge's gavel brought the arguments to a close. The jury will deliberate. The words rang through the room like the toll of a bell. Rick's hands clasped together, steady now, his heart braced. The verdict was imminent, and with it, the final reckoning between truth and lies. The courtroom was a pressure chamber, the air thick and unmoving as the jury filed back into their seats. Each face was unreadable, the solemn weight of their duty etched into their silence. Rick Dalton sat at the defense table, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles ached. Lisa sat behind him, her hands folded in prayer, while Martha watched with the steady calm of a woman who had endured storms before. The judge cleared her throat, her gavel tapping once for order. Members of the jury, she said evenly, have you reached a verdict? The foreman, a middle-aged man with glasses perched low on his nose, rose to his feet. We have, Your Honor. Rick's chest tightened. Time seemed to stretch, each second dragging like an eternity. He stared at the grain of the wood table, afraid to hope, afraid to imagine what would happen if the words went against him. The foreman read from the paper in his hands, his voice steady but carrying the weight of finality. We, the jury, find in favor of the defendant, Richard Dalton. We find the plaintiff's claims to be without merit. The lawsuit is dismissed with prejudice. A gasp swept through the courtroom. Rick's breath caught in his throat. He barely heard the next words, though they thundered with consequence. Furthermore, We recommend restitution for the defendant. Eric Dalton is ordered to pay legal costs and penalties for the fraudulent claim." For a long moment, the courtroom was silent, stunned. Then the murmurs began, reporters scribbling furiously, neighbors whispering, the tide of judgment shifting at last. At the plaintiff's table, Eric collapsed into his chair, his face crumpling. His cane clattered to the floor as he buried his face in his hands. But instead of grief, it was rage that spilled out. His sobs shook the room, not of sorrow, but of a man whose schemes had shattered. He pounded his fist against the table, his voice muffled through his hands. "This isn't fair. This isn't fair." Rick sat motionless, staring ahead. He had won. The world had finally seen the truth. Yet instead of triumph, a hollow ache filled his chest. Victory hadn't restored what was lost. It had only carved deeper lines between father and son. Lisa rose quickly, wrapping her arms around him. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "It's over, Dad. It's over. You did it." Her embrace was fierce, desperate, as though she could shield him from the years of pain in that single moment. Rick closed his eyes and let her hold him. He lifted a trembling hand to pat hers, his throat too tight for words. Across the aisle, Martha's lips curved into a small, quiet smile. Relief washed over her face as she leaned forward, resting her chin on her folded hands. She had known this moment would come, had prayed for it, and now it was here. She gave her brother a firm nod when he finally looked her way, steadying him even as his heart swayed between triumph and sorrow. The judge struck the gavel again. "Order. The matter is concluded." But the sound of the gavel was drowned out by Eric's wails. He slammed his fist against the table, shouting at his lawyer, at the jury, at anyone who would listen. "You're all blind. He's the liar, not me. You don't know what he's done." His voice cracked, high and desperate, as officers moved closer, ready to escort him out. Rick turned to look at his son one final time. Their eyes met across the room. Eric's were red, wild with fury, while Rick's carried no fire, only exhaustion and sorrow. For a fleeting moment, Rick thought of the boy Eric had once been, the boy who had clung to his hand after his mother's funeral, who had begged him never to leave. That boy was gone, swallowed by greed and bitterness. Lisa tightened her embrace, pulling him back from the memory. "Don't look at him," she whispered. "Look at me. Look at us. We're still here." Rick nodded faintly, lowering his gaze. He had won, yes, but the victory rang hollow, like a bell struck in an empty church. As the jury filed out and Eric was dragged away in a storm of shouts and tears, Rick rose slowly to his feet. His lawyer congratulated him. Martha placed a steadying hand on his arm. Lisa clung to him with tears and pride. But inside, Rick felt no celebration. The battle was over, but the war inside his heart was far from finished. And as the courthouse emptied, leaving only the echo of Eric's rage in its walls, Rick Dalton stepped outside into the daylight, victorious, but carrying the heavy truth that some wounds never heal. The verdict spread through the small town faster than wildfire. By the next morning, the headlines screamed across local newspapers and TV broadcasts, "Son's fraud exposed. Eric Dalton ordered to pay restitution in case against father." The photographs showed Eric storming out of the courthouse, red-faced and defiant, flanked by deputies. Beside it, a smaller photo captured Rick, quiet and solemn, leaving with Lisa and Martha at his side. The contrast spoke volumes. At the diner where whispers had once condemned him, people now approached Rick with cautious respect. "We're sorry, Rick," one man said, removing his cap. "We should have known better than to believe the worst." Others nodded, their words heavy with guilt. The same mouths that had spread rumors now tried to patch them, praising his dignity, his patience, his strength. For weeks, Rick had endured being painted as a monster, a negligent father who had hurt his own son. Now the narrative had shifted. The town no longer whispered about him. They rallied behind him. Meanwhile, Eric couldn't walk into a store without feeling the sting of shame. At the gas station, customers turned their backs. At the bar where he had once told his tales, the stools fell silent when he entered, until the bartender quietly asked him to leave. He was no longer the victim in their eyes. He was the fraud who tried to destroy his own father. Lisa felt the change most deeply. At church, people who had once avoided them now greeted her warmly, their voices apologetic. "Your father's a good man," they said. "We should have trusted him all along." Lisa held her head high, pride swelling in her chest, as she finally saw her father treated with the respect he deserved. She had defended him all along, and now the world saw the truth. At home, she found Rick sitting in his old chair, the newspaper folded neatly in his lap. He didn't gloat or smile. He simply sat in silence, his weathered face thoughtful. Lisa knelt beside him, resting her hand on his arm. "Dad," she whispered, "you did it. You stood up, and the truth won. I've never been prouder to be your daughter." Rick turned to her, his eyes soft. "I didn't do it for pride, Lisa. I did it because it had to be done. But I won't pretend it doesn't feel good, knowing the family name isn't dirt anymore." Martha arrived later, carrying a fresh pie from the church ladies who had insisted she deliver it. She set it on the counter with a dry chuckle. "Funny how people remember they're your friends again once the tide turns." But her smile was warm when she turned to Rick. "You've been vindicated. That's no small thing. You can hold your head high again." Rick nodded slowly. He had no desire for parades or praise. Quiet satisfaction was enough. He had survived the storm, his dignity intact, and the lies that nearly buried him had been dragged into the light. But the fallout weighed heavier on Eric than even Rick had expected. One evening, Rick passed through town and spotted his son across the street. Eric's shoulders were hunched, his eyes downcast. People crossed the road to avoid him. Conversations stopped when he passed, and children whispered behind their hands. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, stripped of the bravado that had once fueled him. Rick lingered for only a moment, torn between pity and justice. Then he drove on, his hands steady on the wheel. For the first time in months, Rick slept soundly. The voices of accusation were gone, replaced by silence that carried no judgment. Yet beneath the peace, something else lingered. Satisfaction, yes, but also hollowness. Winning the battle hadn't restored his son. It had destroyed him. The community might have rallied. Lisa might have reclaimed her pride. Martha might have sighed in relief that the Dalton name was no longer tarnished. But Rick knew better than anyone. The cost of the truth was permanent. Still, as he sat on his porch in the evening light, the wind rustling the fields around him, Rick allowed himself the smallest of smiles. He had faced betrayal and humiliation, and he had not broken. The truth had spoken louder than the lies. And yet, in the distance, in the shadow of his thoughts, he wondered what price his son would pay next, because Eric Dalton was not a man who would go quietly into ruin. Eric Dalton's downfall came quickly. The restitution order, the legal fees, the whispers that turned to stares. Everything closed in on him at once. Creditors who once granted him leniency now called day and night. His phone buzzed endlessly. Voicemails piling up, each one harsher than the last. Final notice. Immediate payment required. Account referred to collections. The apartment he had once boasted about now echoed with emptiness. Furniture was repossessed. The fridge sat nearly bare, and past due notices littered the kitchen table. Eric paced, muttering curses, his hair unkempt, his face hollowed by sleepless nights. When he turned to Lisa for help, she met him with silence. She opened the door just enough to look him in the eye. He was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, his voice tinged with desperation. "Lisa, please," he begged, "just alone, enough to get these vultures off my back." Her eyes hardened. Alone? After everything? You dragged Dad's name through the mud, tried to bleed him dry, and you want me to give you more money? Eric's face twisted, shifting between pleading and anger. I'm your brother. You don't turn your back on family. You already did, she whispered, her voice tight with restrained fury. You don't want family. You want a lifeline, and I won't give you one. She shut the door before he could reply. Eric stood there for a long moment, fists clenched, before retreating down the empty street. When Lisa told her father about the encounter, Rick only nodded. He knew it wouldn't end there, and he was right. One evening, as Rick sat in his chair by the window, the phone rang. He hesitated, knowing before he even answered who it would be. He lifted the receiver slowly. Dad. Eric's voice was hoarse, frayed at the edges. Please. I need help. They're going to take everything. I've got people threatening me. You don't understand. If you don't help me, I'm finished. Rick closed his eyes, the weight of the words pressing on his chest. He heard not just the desperation of a man at the end of his rope, but the echoes of all the times before, the lies, the manipulation, the endless taking. Eric, Rick said softly, I've helped you my whole life, paid your debts, carried your burdens, stood by you when no one else would, and every time you came back for more. But this is where it ends. Don't say that, Eric snapped, panic giving way to anger. You're my father. You owe me this, after all you've done. No, Rick interrupted, his voice firm, steady. I don't owe you anything, not anymore. You made your choices, and now you live with them. There was a long silence on the line. Then Eric's voice exploded, raw and venomous. You selfish old man, you ruined me. You think you're better than me? I'll see you rot before I beg again. Rick didn't flinch. He held the receiver, his hand steady, his face calm. Then, without another word, he hung up. The click of the line echoed through the quiet house, final and absolute. Lisa, sitting nearby, looked at him with wide eyes. Dad, are you okay? Rick leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. His heart ached, but not from regret. For the first time, he had drawn a line that could not be crossed. His voice was low, almost to himself. No more. The house was silent again. Outside, the night pressed close, heavy and uncertain. Rick stared at the phone, knowing Eric's curses would echo long after the line went dead. And though he had chosen peace for himself, he couldn't shake the sense that Eric's spiral was far from over. The knock came on Eric Dalton's door just after dawn. When he opened it, Detective Harris stood there with two uniformed officers. Eric's once defiant smirk faltered as Harris read the charges aloud. Insurance fraud, perjury, attempted civil extortion. His voice carried no malice, only the weight of law. Eric tried to bluster. This is ridiculous. You've got nothing on me. But his tone lacked conviction. The officers stepped forward, placing cuffs around his wrists. The metal clink echoed through the small, cluttered apartment like the sound of a gavel striking judgment. By noon, word had spread across the town. The same headlines that once painted Eric as a victim now carried his disgrace. Eric Dalton faces fraud charges. Pattern of scams revealed. When Lisa heard, she sat at the kitchen table, her hands covering her face. The news broke her, even though she had known deep down this moment was coming. He's my brother, she whispered, her voice cracking. No matter what he's done, he's still my brother. Tears streaked down her cheeks, but her eyes, red and swollen, carried a weary acceptance. And now he's lost. Rick sat across from her, his hands folded. He didn't reach for her immediately. His face was somber, but behind his silence was a quiet pride, not for his son's downfall, but for the truth finally standing tall after so many years of being beaten down. Lisa, he said softly, Sometimes love means letting someone fall. Eric built this life with his own choices. Now he's got to live with them. Martha entered the room, her eyes sharp as she set down the newspaper. She leaned against the counter, her voice steady and unsparing. Justice has a cost. You can't have it without someone paying. Eric's paying now for everything he's done, and maybe it's the only way he'll ever face himself. Lisa turned to her aunt, her voice trembling. But prison, fraud charges. That's not who I thought he'd become. I kept thinking he'd wake up, turn it around. Martha shook her head. We all thought that at one point, but hoping for someone to change doesn't make it so. Across town, Eric sat in a holding cell, the arrogance drained from him. He slumped on the bench, staring at the concrete floor, his hands hanging between his knees. Gone was the sneering confidence, the smirk he wore like armor. In its place was something closer to fear. The man who had once spun lies so easily now faced a reality that couldn't be bent to his will. Court date was set within weeks. The judge scheduled a sentencing hearing, the word itself echoing in Rick's ears. Sentencing, finality. A chapter closing in a way no father could ever have imagined. When the news reached Rick, he sat long into the night by the window, staring out at the quiet town. He felt no triumph, no joy. What swelled inside him was quieter, deeper. Pride, not in Eric's ruin, but in his own endurance. He had stood against betrayal, humiliation, and despair, and he had not fallen. The truth had carried him through. But pride came with its own shadow. A son in chains was still a son. Rick knew that no verdict, no restitution, no jail cell could erase the blood between them. Yet he also knew the final stage was upon them. The lies had been burned away. What was left now was justice. He whispered into the quiet night, as if speaking to no one and everyone at once. It's almost done. The courtroom was packed for sentencing day. The same benches that once filled with whispers of Rick's guilt were now crowded with townsfolk eager to witness Eric Dalton's fate. The hush inside was suffocating, the kind of silence that stretched on the edge of something irreversible. Eric sat at the defense table, his suit wrinkled, his face pale and drawn. The smug bravado that had carried him for so long was gone, replaced with a jittering nervousness. He tapped his foot rapidly, his hands trembling as he clenched and unclenched them. Rick sat a few rows back, not in the front, not seeking attention, just there, still, as he had always been. Lisa sat beside him, her eyes swollen, her hand gripping his tightly. Martha sat on Rick's other side, her jaw set in stone. The judge entered, robes flowing, and the entire courtroom rose. Once everyone was seated again, the judge's voice carried across the room, clear and heavy with authority. Eric Dalton, you stand before this court convicted of multiple counts of insurance fraud, perjury, and attempted extortion. Your pattern of deceit has harmed not only businesses, not only the justice system, but your own family. This court finds such behavior intolerable. The words fell like hammer blows. Eric's breathing quickened. He glanced at Lisa, silently pleading for her to intercede, but she looked away, tears running down her cheeks. She could weep for him, but she could no longer defend him. The judge's eyes sharpened. For these crimes, I hereby sentence you to 10 years in state prison. The words echoed like gunfire. A stunned silence blanketed the courtroom. No one gasped, no one cheered. There was only stillness, the weight of justice filling the air. Eric shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. 10 years? You can't do this. I was set up. This is all lies. His voice broke, cracking into desperation. He turned wildly toward Lisa. Tell them I'm not what they say. Lisa sobbed openly, but she didn't move. Her silence was louder than words. Eric's eyes swung to Rick then, rage and desperation fused into one. Say something. You're my father. Don't just sit there. Help me." But Rick did not move. His face was unreadable, his eyes fixed straight ahead. For months, years even, he had carried the burden of his son's lies, his anger, his betrayal. But in this moment, there was no more to carry. Justice had spoken. "Bailiff," the judge ordered calmly. 2 deputies seized Eric by the arms. He thrashed violently, his voice rising into a scream. "This isn't over. You hear me, old man. You'll pay for this. You'll all pay." His words cracked as he kicked against the floor, dragged toward the side door. His shouts echoed down the hallway, even after he was gone, until only silence remained. Rick exhaled slowly, leaning back against the bench. His body didn't shake, his face didn't soften. He remained unmoved, as though his heart had prepared for this moment long before it arrived. Beside him, Lisa wept into her hands, Martha wrapping an arm firmly around her shoulders. "It had to be this way," Martha whispered, her own eyes damp. "Justice has been served, and justice has a cost." The gavel struck once more, final and resolute. Court was adjourned. As Rick rose to leave, the reporters descended. Microphones and cameras crowded him in the hallway, questions flying like arrows. "Mr. Dalton, how do you feel about your son's sentence? Do you think 10 years is too harsh? Will you forgive him?" Rick walked through the chaos in silence, his eyes forward, his steps measured. He did not raise his voice, did not offer a soundbite. He simply pushed through, Lisa at his side, Martha guiding them toward the exit. His silence was its own answer. Some things could not be packaged into words for headlines. Outside, the sky was a sharp blue, the kind that felt almost cruel after the weight of a storm. Rick paused at the courthouse steps, breathing in the crisp air. He had survived. He had won. But victory didn't taste sweet. It tasted like ashes. Lisa touched his arm, her voice breaking softly. "Dad, what now?" Rick's eyes stayed on the horizon, hard and distant. "Now," he said quietly, "we live with it." The house was quiet again. Too quiet. Rick Dalton sat in his worn recliner, the only sound the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. The stillness pressed in on him, a silence that carried the weight of absence. Across the room, the framed photo of his late wife rested on the shelf. Her smile was gentle, her eyes filled with a warmth that seemed almost alive in the dim light. Rick stared at it for a long time, his hand resting on the arm of his chair. Finally, he whispered into the empty room, his voice raw and low. "I did what I had to." The words barely carried, but they filled the space all the same. It was not an excuse, not a plea, just a truth spoken aloud to the one person who might have understood him. He had stood against his own son, and though justice had been served, the victory sat heavy in his chest. The creak of the front door pulled him from his thoughts. Lisa stepped in, her children trailing behind her, their voices rising in cheerful chatter. The weight of silence lifted at once, replaced with the sound of small feet racing across the floor and laughter bouncing off the walls. "Grandpa!" the youngest cried, throwing himself onto Rick's lap. Rick chuckled softly, the sound awkward at first, as though laughter had become a language he'd forgotten. His arms closed around the boy instinctively, and for the first time in weeks, he felt something warm stir inside him. Lisa leaned in the doorway watching, her face softened by relief. She could see the lines of weariness in her father's eyes, the shadow of sorrow that never left him. But she also saw the flicker of life as he let the children climb into his lap, tug at his hands, pepper him with questions. "Did you really drive trains?" one asked, confusion muddling memory with imagination. Rick chuckled again, shaking his head. "Steel, not trains. I worked with steel, hard work, honest work." They nodded as though he had just shared a secret, their laughter spilling over again. Rick smiled faintly, his hand resting on the head of his granddaughter, who had curled into the crook of his arm. Lisa walked over and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore, Dad," she said softly. "We're here. We'll always be here." Rick nodded, but his eyes flicked once more to the photo of his wife. Shadows lingered there, reminders of what had been lost and what could never be mended. The laughter filled the house, and he cherished it, but the ache beneath it all remained. For a fleeting moment, though, the sound of his grandchildren's joy quieted the heaviness in his chest. The house felt alive again, even if only for a little while. Rick leaned back, closing his eyes as the children's voices swirled around him. A flicker of peace warmed him, fragile, temporary, but real. Yet as the night stretched on and the house quieted again, he knew the shadows would return. That night, Rick Dalton dreamed of Eric, not the bitter, angry man who had stood against him in court, but the boy he used to be. In the dream, Eric was 6 years old again, chasing fireflies in the backyard with a jar in his hands, his laughter ringing through the summer air. His hair stuck to his forehead with sweat, his face alive with wonder as he turned to his father. "Look, Dad, I caught one," the boy cried, holding up the glowing jar. Rick reached for him in the dream, his voice caught somewhere between pride and sorrow. But as he reached, the image blurred, the boy fading into the man, the sneer, the cane, the courtroom. The fireflies winked out one by one, and darkness swallowed everything. Rick jerked awake in the middle of the night, tears streaking down his cheeks. His chest ached sharply, his breath ragged. He clutched at his shirt, his hand pressed against the thrum of his heartbeat. For a terrifying moment, he thought it might stop altogether. The room was silent, but for his uneven breathing. He sat up, burying his face in his hands. The dream lingered. Sharper than memory, cutting deeper than truth. The next morning, Martha found him sitting at the kitchen table, eyes rimmed red, his coffee untouched. She sat down across from him, her gaze steady. "Rough night?" Rick nodded slowly, his voice thick. "I dreamed of him as a boy, before all this. He was just a kid, Martha. Just my son. And now—" His voice cracked. He wiped at his face, frustrated by the tears. "Now he's in a cell, hating me. And I can't stop asking myself, did I do the right thing, or did I just destroy him?" Martha reached across the table, taking his hand firmly. Her voice was calm, unwavering. "Rick, listen to me. You didn't destroy him. He destroyed himself. You gave him every chance. You gave him your time, your money, your patience, more than anyone would have. Truth mattered, and if you hadn't stood up, he would have dragged you under with him. You know that." Rick's shoulders slumped. He wanted to believe her, but the image of the little boy with the firefly jar haunted him. Then why does it feel like I lost anyway? Lisa arrived not long after, her children playing quietly in the other room. She saw the weariness etched into her father's face, the hollow in his eyes. Sitting beside him, she wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "You carried him longer than you should have, Dad," she whispered. "You carried his lies, his debts, his anger, and still you loved him. Nothing that happened changes that. Don't doubt yourself now." Rick looked at her, his daughter's face so full of compassion, and for a moment he allowed himself to lean into her comfort. But the doubt lingered all the same, heavy as iron. Later, as he sat alone again, he stared at the family photographs on the wall, the ones from years ago, before the fractures, before the betrayal. A family smiling for the camera, a wife now gone, children still innocent. He wondered what she would think if she could see them now. Would she see justice or tragedy? Rick whispered into the silence. "Did revenge heal anything? Or did it just leave me with ashes?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. He knew Martha's words, Lisa's reassurance, but his heart remained torn. He had fought for truth, and truth had won. yet the cost still bled into every quiet corner of his life. And so, as the night deepened and shadows pressed against the windows, Rick sat with his conflict unresolved, knowing the battle was over, but the war inside him had only just begun. Rick Dalton sat in Dr. Green's office, the blinds half drawn against the morning sun. The smell of antiseptic hung faint in the air, mixing with the quiet tick of the wall clock. Dr. Green leaned back in his chair, hands folded, his voice calm but firm. "Rick, we've managed to steady your heart for now," he said, "but you can't outrun time. You need to think ahead, plan your affairs, write a will. Don't leave it undone." The words sank like stones. Rick nodded slowly, staring at his weathered hands. A will. The final stamp on a life lived. He had always avoided the thought, as if ignoring it could somehow delay the inevitable. But the truth was plain now. He had to decide what his legacy would mean. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table, papers spread out before him. Lisa's children laughed in the living room, their voices bright and carefree. Rick smiled faintly at the sound, but the smile faltered when his eyes drifted to Eric's empty chair in his memory. His son was alive, but gone all the same, shut away in prison, swallowed by his own choices. Martha joined him at the table, her voice steady. "You're thinking about what to leave behind." Rick nodded, his voice quiet. "Lisa's kids. They've brought me more joy than I deserve. Maybe they should have it all. The house, the savings, what's left of my pension. At least then the Dalton name carries something good forward." Martha gave a small smile. "That would be a legacy, Rick. A real one. And those children will grow up knowing their grandfather stood for something. They'll remember your strength, not Eric's mistakes." Rick lowered his gaze, guilt gnawing at him. "But what about him? Eric's still my son. If I write him out completely, what does that make me? A father who erased his child?" His voice broke slightly. "I keep thinking of him as a boy. He used to follow me everywhere, wanted to be just like me, and now he hates me." Martha's eyes softened. "You didn't erase him, Rick. He erased himself. There's a difference. You can't build your legacy on someone else's ruin. You can only build it on truth." Later, Lisa found her father staring at the papers again, his expression heavy. She touched his shoulder gently. "Dad, you don't need to feel guilty. You gave Eric everything, more than most fathers would. You paid his debts, forgave his lies, even stood silent when he shamed you in public. But you can't let his choices define what your name means." Rick turned to her, his eyes glistening. "Lisa, I don't want my grandchildren to remember me for courtrooms and scandals. I want them to remember me as a man who lived with honor. But if I cut Eric out completely, I'll be remembered as a father who gave up on his son." Lisa knelt beside him, gripping his hand. "No, you'll be remembered as a man who stood for truth, even when it broke your heart. That's the legacy, Dad. Not giving up, standing firm." Her words lingered, heavy but clarifying. Rick sat in silence for a long while, the laughter of his grandchildren echoing from the next room. Slowly, he picked up the pen, his hand trembling as he signed his name. "I'll leave it to them," he whispered. "Lisa's children. They'll carry the Dalton name forward, and maybe when they speak it, it won't be in shame, but in pride." Martha exhaled softly, a mix of relief and sorrow. Lisa pressed her forehead to her father's arm, whispering, "That's the right choice. That's love." Rick leaned back, staring at the ceiling, his voice low but certain. "Legacy isn't money. It isn't property. It's truth. And truth is what I'll leave behind." The pen rested on the table, the ink drying on paper that marked the final shape of his life's work. Yet even as he signed away what remained, the shadow of Eric lingered. The guilt would never leave entirely. Rick closed his eyes, the sounds of his grandchildren filling the room. For the first time, he felt clarity about what must endure after him. But clarity did not erase the ache, And as the night settled in, the question of what Eric would make of his own name remained unanswered. The prison smelled of steel and disinfectant, its gray walls pressing down with a weight that made every breath feel heavier. Rick Dalton walked through the corridor slowly, the echo of his boots following him. He had debated coming at all. For weeks, the letter from the prison chaplain had sat on his desk, an invitation he had turned over and over until finally he gave in. When the guard opened the door to the visitation room, Rick's eyes fell on his son. Eric was seated at the metal table, dressed in the standard orange jumpsuit. His once broad shoulders slumped inward, his face gaunt, his skin pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. The arrogance, the sneer, both gone. What remained was bitterness, etched into every line of his face. Eric looked up as his father entered, and for a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was louder than words. Rick sat down slowly, his hands folded on the cold table. "You destroyed me," Eric spat finally, his voice low but laced with venom. His eyes burned with a mix of anger and despair. "You stood in that courtroom and let them rip me apart, my own father. You could have saved me, but you didn't. You let them bury me." Rick's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "No, Eric, you destroyed yourself. I didn't make you lie. I didn't make you scheme. I didn't put you here. You did." Eric's face twisted, his hands balling into fists. "You think you're some hero? You think this makes you righteous? You'll die alone. And I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of father you really were." Rick held his son's gaze, the weight of decades pressing in on him. "Say what you want. Hate me if you need to. But the truth doesn't change. You chose this path, and now you're living with it." The words hung in the air, heavy as chains. Eric leaned back in his chair, his breathing sharp, his eyes darting to the side, as if to escape the weight of his father's calm. But there was no escape. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights and the distant clang of cell doors. Rick waited, giving his son one last chance to speak, one last chance to reach for something other than bitterness. But Eric said nothing. His lips pressed into a hard line, his stare cold and unyielding. Finally, Rick pushed back his chair. The sound scraped against the concrete floor, final and unforgiving. He rose slowly, steady, and looked down at his son one last time. "I came here because part of me still hoped you'd see the truth," Rick said softly. "But I see now. That's not what you want. You'd rather hate me than face yourself. So be it." Eric's eyes flickered for a moment, something sharp, something broken, but the mask of defiance returned quickly. He turned his head away, refusing to meet his father's gaze. Rick nodded once, the gesture small, resolute. Then he turned and walked toward the door. The guard stepped forward, unlocking it with a loud metallic click. Behind him, Eric sat rigid, silent, the weight of his bitterness his only companion. Rick didn't look back, not once. The walk out of the visitation room felt like walking away from a grave, final, cold, unchangeable. Outside, the sun was setting, streaks of orange and red bleeding across the horizon. Rick paused for a moment, breathing in the evening air, his chest heavy. There was no reconciliation, no peace to be found in that room, only silence, and the knowledge that some wounds never healed. And as he stepped back toward his car, Rick understood. The road ahead would not bring them together. It would only carry him further away. The pain came suddenly, sharp and crushing, as if an iron band had wrapped around Rick Dalton's chest. He gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, his breath ragged, his vision blurring. The laughter of his grandchildren in the living room faded into muffled echoes as the world tilted around him. "Dad!" Lisa's voice cut through the haze as she rushed to his side. She grabbed his arm, her face pale with fear. "Call an ambulance, now!" The next moments blurred, sirens, stretchers. the sterile lights of the hospital corridor flashing overhead as he was wheeled through. Rick drifted in and out, his thoughts tangled between past and present. His wife's face, Eric as a child, Lisa's hand clutching his. When he opened his eyes again, Dr. Green stood over him, calm but grave. "You gave us a scare, Rick," he said softly. "Your heart's weaker than before. We stabilized you, but you can't keep pushing like this. If you don't slow down, next time we might not be able to pull you back." Rick managed a faint smile, his voice rough. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing, Doc. I've fought enough battles. Maybe it's time I let go." Lisa, seated at his bedside, shook her head fiercely. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she gripped his hand. "Don't talk like that. Please, Dad, we still need you. The kids need you. I need you." Rick turned his head toward her, his eyes soft with love. "You've carried me more than you know, Lisa. But I can rest now. For the first time in a long time, I can rest." His smile was faint but steady, as though he had finally made peace with the weight of his years. Martha stood in the corner, her composure breaking as tears welled in her eyes. She stepped forward, brushing her brother's gray hair back with trembling hands. "Don't you dare leave me yet, Rick," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Not like this. You've carried us all, and I'm not ready to lose you." Rick reached for her hand, squeezing gently. "You won't lose me, Martha. Not really. I'll always be here, in this family, in the truth we fought for." The door burst open then, and his grandchildren ran in, their small voices filling the sterile room with brightness. They climbed onto the bed carefully, hugging him, chattering about school and games, their laughter spilling into the air like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Rick chuckled weakly, his chest rising with the effort, but his eyes lit up with warmth. "You all sound like angels," he whispered, kissing the top of his granddaughter's head. For a moment, the shadows lifted. The machines, the monitors, the hospital walls, they all seemed to fade as the sound of family surrounded him. Peace flickered in his heart, fragile but real, like a candle in the dark. Yet, as Lisa looked at her father, her smile trembling with both relief and fear, she knew the shadows weren't gone. They lingered, waiting. This was only a reprieve. The fight for his life wasn't finished, and deep down, she knew the final reckoning was closer than ever. Months had passed since Rick Dalton's heart scare, months since Eric's sentencing had locked the final door between them. Life in the small town had settled into its rhythms again. Neighbors waved, Lisa's children filled the house with laughter, Martha checked in daily. Outwardly, things looked steady, but inside, Rick carried an unfinished weight. One morning, beneath a pale sky, streaked with winter clouds, he made a decision. He called the prison and scheduled a visit. He didn't tell Lisa, didn't tell Martha. This was something he had to face alone. The prison gates loomed tall, metal, and unyielding. Rick walked through the security checks with slow, deliberate steps, his breath steady, but his heart heavy. The guard led him down a corridor, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The sound of keys and the clang of steel doors marked every step, each one echoing like a reminder of finality. When Rick entered the visitation room, Eric was already there, sitting at a metal table. The sight of him made Rick pause. His son looked nothing like the man who once strutted into town in false braces and a smirk. His frame was thinner, his skin sallow, his hair unkempt. His eyes, once sharp with arrogance, were dull, lifeless, hollow. Eric barely lifted his head. When he finally looked up, his voice came out as a whisper, coarse and broken. "I hate you, but you won." The words cut, not because they surprised Rick, but because of the emptiness behind them. His son had no fire left, no venom, just ashes. Rick lowered himself into the chair across from him, folding his hands slowly on the cold surface between them. His voice was calm, steady, but it carried a weight that filled the room. No, Eric, I didn't win. Truth did. You fought it, you twisted it, you tried to bury it. But in the end, truth doesn't break. Eric's lips pressed together, trembling. For a brief moment, it seemed as though he might say more, might try to argue or lash out. But nothing came. He slumped back, his gaze falling to the floor, silence pressing down on him like chains. Rick studied him quietly. This was the boy he had raised, the man he had lost, and now the broken shell left behind. There was no reconciliation here, no embrace or forgiveness waiting on the other side of words. Only separation, a chasm that could never be bridged. The silence stretched. Neither man moved. Neither man reached across the table. The years between them, the choices, the betrayals, they had built walls too high to climb. Finally, Rick stood. The chair scraped against the floor, the sound final and sharp. He looked down at Eric one last time, his voice quiet but firm. I hope someday you see it. Not for me, not for anyone else, for yourself. But I won't wait for that day. I can't. Eric didn't respond. His shoulders sagged, his eyes fixed on the table. Rick turned and walked toward the door. He didn't look back. Not once. The guard unlocked it with a metallic click, and Rick stepped through, leaving his son behind. Outside, the clouds began to break. Shafts of sunlight spilled through, golden against the gray, warming the cold air. Rick paused on the steps, breathing it in. The weight on his chest didn't vanish, but something inside him loosened, if only slightly. This wasn't healing. This wasn't forgiveness. But it was resolution. Hard, cold, unyielding. He had faced his son one final time, and he had chosen to walk away. As he made his way toward his car, Rick tilted his face to the sunlight. It touched him gently, reminding him that life moved forward, that endings didn't always come with peace, but with truth. And for Richard Dalton, truth was enough.